Hi guys, Brian from Boas here. The choice of substrate that you pick to line the bottom of your Boas enclosure is critical to its health and well-being. Today I'm going to review the different substrates I use and discuss why I pick each for a given situation. I'm also going to discuss a substrate that I recommend that you avoid at all costs and never use, so be sure to stay tuned for that. If you're new to the channel, this is the place for information about all aspects of boa constrictors. So if you want to learn all about keeping and breeding these amazing animals, be sure to subscribe to the channel. So when we think about the function of the substrate, they have to accomplish several different functions. So they're at the bottom of the cage. The point is that they absorb all of the wastes and odors that your animal produces, and they should also provide a comfortable spot for your animal to rest on. In addition, they should look aesthetically pleasing, be simple and easy to change, be convenient to compost or recycle, and be inexpensive and preferably free. So of course there's no one substrate that meets all of these different criteria. There's no one perfect substrate, and it's going to depend on what you're looking for and what you prioritize in your substrate as far as what you pick. In addition, there's really two main types of substrates. There's the particulate, which are kind of wood-based substrates, which come in lots of little flakes or pellets or things like that. And then there's the paper-based substrates, which come in sheets of paper or the like. And I use both of them given different applications. The main particulate substrate I'm using now is something called Coco Coir, which is this fibers that come out of a coconut shell. So the coconut, as you may know, there's the inner nut, which is the part we eat, and then there's the outer husk, which is called the coir. And the coir is this really spongy, fibrous, wood type material. And basically it's a relatively new product. It's used a lot in gardening, but it makes a really good substrate for reptiles as well. And when you buy the Coco Coir, there's different types. This is something called cocoa chip. There's also this type called cocoa fibers, which is more of the fibers like this. And then there's something called cocoa peat, which is more the fine, kind of dusty particles that are better for gardening. So you want to get the cocoa chip substrate if you want to use this for your boas. And I'll show you how you can reconstitute it. This is the brand of Coco Coir I use. It's called Pro Coco, and no, I don't get paid money by them. So this particular one, this is the cocoa chip. As I mentioned, there's also the cocoa peat and the cocoa fibers. You want the cocoa chip. It's got a picture of a reptile on the cover. And it comes in these 2 cubic foot blocks. And so the blocks need to be reconstituted with water, which I'll show you in the next scene. So I'm going to add the water to reconstitute this Coco Coir. This is a 10-pound block, which reconstitutes to about 2.5 cubic feet. So basically I can line about 5 or so of these large boa tubs, or about 4 4-foot snake cages. So you have to cut it out of the block, or out of the package. So you can see it's a solid block that's been compressed. And when we add water, it's going to expand and absorb all that water like a sponge. So typically I use about 1.5 to 2 gallons for each of these blocks. So I'm just going to pour the water in, and I have it in this 14-gallon Sterilite tub. And you need to let it soak up the water for several hours. And once it starts to soak up the water, it kind of falls apart, and you can kind of break it into pieces that you're going to use as your substrate. And this stuff's like a sponge. It absorbs a huge amount of water. And so usually I give it a day or two to just soak up the water before it's ready to use. And sometimes it's too humid when you first reconstitute it. So I let it dry out for several days because I don't want it to be too humid in my reptiles enclosures either. I started using that Coco Coir about 1.5 years ago, and initially I didn't like it very much because you have to go through the step of reconstituting it, and then it gets really humid. I made the mistake of using it right after I reconstituted it before I let it dry a bit, and it added too much humidity to my Boas enclosures. They would actually fog up on the sides, and I'd have to go wipe it down with paper towels. But I learned if you just let it dry for a few days to a week or so, it's not nearly as humid, and it's, as I mentioned, it's really good for maintaining the high humidity of 60 to 80% that boa constrictors need. And I haven't had any issues with shedding or anything like that since I put my boa constrictors on it. I usually just spray it down, a couple times a week just to maintain that humidity. So the Coco Coir is kind of expensive. Each block is something like around 12, 13 bucks, but then you got to pay the shipping. So it works out to be about $20 a block for me right now. And because this stuff's relatively new, I can't get it locally, but I think once it catches on, it'll be available at local garden centers, and I'll be able to get it for a more affordable price. And what's really advantageous about this stuff is it lasts a long time. If you go and you spot clean and remove all the waste products, it can last for months because this stuff doesn't mold nearly as easily as some other substrates, and it just lasts a very long time. So even though it's more expensive, the time that you save in not having to do a total substrate change may well be worth it. In addition to the cocoa chips, I'm using a couple paper-based substrates. And paper-based substrates are really convenient because you can just change them all in one big piece. You just remove the paper, throw it away, put in new paper. It's a lot quicker to change than this Coco Coir. The downside, of course, it doesn't last nearly as long as the Coco Coir. And the couple substrates I'm using, the first is corrugated cardboard wrap. And so I can get these big rolls of this corrugated cardboard from Uline. They come in 250-foot rolls. The rolls are all different widths. I use the 24-inch wide width for my boa cages, as well as the 30-inch wide width for both my cages and for my tubs. This is the 30-inch wide width. So this particular roll is almost out. I've used up most of it. When it comes, it's this big wide roll. It's several feet in diameter. It's 250 feet long, and then I just cut it to size, either a 3-foot or 4-foot or 6-foot piece, however long I need for my cage. This is the 3-foot by 30-inch piece that I can use in these boa tubs behind me. And one of the benefits of this corrugated paper is it's got this rough surface, and the boas seem to enjoy resting against this. It gives them something rough to rest against. Some boas don't like resting against smooth paper, but the corrugated, they seem to feel a little more easy, or a little more comfortable resting against this stuff. So this stuff, unfortunately, doesn't really last all that long. Every time the boas, relieve themselves on it, you basically have to change it. So you're changing it pretty much every week. And the other disadvantage is the cost. So this stuff, when I first got it, a roll, a 250-foot roll, was about $35 to $40 for the 24 and 30-inch width. And then the shipping would run about $30. So basically it worked out to be about $1 for each of these pieces of substrate. However, for reasons I don't understand, the shipping lately has gone through the roof. And Uline, when I went to order the stuff, they wanted $120 for shipping for a $35 roll. So I didn't do that. It was just too much for the shipping. And I looked at other suppliers online. Unfortunately, they all wanted like $120. So that basically works out to be around 3 times the price, or probably about $3 a sheet. And at that price point, it really doesn't make sense for me. So I still have a supply of it that I'm going to use up, and then maybe it'll be less expensive. But if it continues to be this expensive, I'm either going to try to find a local supplier or I'm going to stop using it. I found the main advantage of the rough texture with this stuff you can get just by putting cage furnishing that have a rough texture, like bark and, you know, oak bark tubes, things like that, the boas like to rest against that. So even if you're using a smooth paper like newspaper, as long as you have a rough furnishing for the boa to rest against, you don't really need the advantage of this textured corrugated cardboard. And the other downside with this stuff is it molds really fast. You know, as soon as your boa defecates on it, it's going to start molding, and it just doesn't stay clean for very long. Which leads us to the last substrate that I use a lot, and that's just basic newspaper. And this stuff has the advantage of being basically free. I can get as much of it as I need. It's really quick and easy to change. As soon as the animals mess up the cage, you take it all out and then you just replace it with more of this stuff. And usually I use, you know, 3 or 4 thicknesses at the bottom of the cage. Obviously it's not the most nice looking stuff if you want, you know, an aesthetically pleasing cage. It's also not the most absorbent stuff, but it works pretty well, and it's, as I mentioned, really quick to change. It's cheap. It's really easy to dispose of. You can just compost it in your backyard. So a lot of people look down on newspaper because it's basically refuse. But the boas, a lot of them don't seem to mind as long as you have a textured piece of furniture in the cage for them to rest against. And then some don't seem to mind just resting against the newspaper. I've seen some boas, they kind of, you know, when you put them right on newspaper, they're looking for something to grab against. But this is really easy to mitigate, as I mentioned, with something with texture in the cage for the boa to rest against. So in that case, newspaper will work just fine. How do I decide which of these substrates to use for a particular boa? Well, first of all, for breeding boas, I almost always use a paper-based substrate, either the cardboard or just simply newspaper. And the reason being is that breeding boas is a pretty messy business. They create a lot of body fluids and, you know, spray stuff on the sides of the cage as well as on each other. And so it's a lot easier to just quickly change this paper substrate than worrying about this particular substrate. In addition, this mess that they make is kind of sticky, and I found that the substrate like coconut or another particulate wood-based substrate will get stuck to the boas, and it can get stuck in some pretty sensitive areas of the boa's anatomy. So for that reason, I almost always use paper substrate for my boas when they're breeding, either cardboard or just newspaper. For boas that need more humidity, I'll use the coconut coir. So if a boa is having some issues with shedding, I'll put it on that substrate and I'll just, you know, spray it down several times a week, and the shedding issues usually will go away real quickly. So I've been using it a lot with baby boas because, you know, baby boas sometimes have shedding issues, but the coconut coir really seems to help. So there's no perfect substrate. I know people have their own substrate choices, and, you know, some of them stick to them like a religion, and they, you know, attack other people that don't use their same substrate. So use whatever substrate works for you. So I'm not going to tell you what's right or wrong. It all depends on your particular situation. One substrate that I personally have decided to never use again is aspen. Okay, and I had been using aspen somewhat, and, you know, one of the main disadvantages with this stuff is it's really dusty. Some aspen is a lot more dusty than others depending on how it's shredded, but I would usually have to use a dust mask to avoid breathing the aspen dust, and I was sneezing, and then the dust was getting all over the place. So of course this can't be good for the poor snakes. And so aspen, in addition, molds pretty quickly. It's not very absorbent, so it starts to mold, and it has to be changed a lot more often than the coconut coir bedding. Another downside with aspen is that it tends to stick to food items. So when you give your boa a rat, if it's a little bit wet, the aspen will stick to it, and it's possible your boa might ingest some of the aspen. So I personally have never had any issues with my boas having any kind of negative impact from ingesting substrate, but I have heard a lot of stories. So all things being equal, you want a substrate that's not going to stick to the food. Any kind of particular wood-based substrate has that tendency more so than the paper-based substrates, but with the aspen it can be really finely shredded, and it really has a tendency to stick to the rodent. So another reason to avoid aspen. So those are my thoughts on substrates for your boa. I hope this was helpful. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to me. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your boas.